Thank you very, very much, Michelle, for this wide-ranging talk, which concludes with a very complex set of issues, but concludes with some simple to-dos. Hope matters, institutions matter, and the question is, how are we able to change both the narratives and the institutional structures that could foster a better society. With that, let me just open the discussion immediately. I have two questions, but I'm going to reserve them and say that the questions can be addressed to both Helga and to Michelle or jointly. So please feel free to raise your hands. I have a question here.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Lamont. My question is, how do we address power structures within the terms of who produces certain narratives of both stigmatization and destigmatization? So meaning, yes, of course, institutions and groups are a part of both creating stigmatization and destigmatization. So through that, my question is, how do we address them, and where do we place them in different spaces, kind of in addressing social inequalities and different dispositions that people have, the majority, the minority, the hegemonic people who are a part of this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways, should I answer now? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The description of the paper, the social science and medicine paper on the destigmatization of these three groups, meant to address this in part. I think that we already have a huge number of studies about the ways in which the dominant groups aim to maintain their domination. I'm just going to mention one example. Jane Mansbridge has a wonderful book titled Why We Lost the ERA, which was a major legislation for equal representation of women. And that's an example of, the legal battles. So I think legal historians, or, do an enormous amount of retroactive, or historians in general, analysis of what battles were lost. And there are, I think it's, in the literature, we know a lot, I think, already about what stops it. What is not done sufficiently is to think normatively about what are the points for action. The diagnosis is much more easily delivered than the question of how do we mobilize for social change. I wish I was, do you have answers? I'm sure you do.
Well, let me answer from a slightly different angle. And it relates also to what you said. One of the power structures, if you want, dominance, is related to a principle that we all approve and believe in, namely meritocracy. Meritocracy is part of our educational system. It goes all the way from selectivity, from first years of school, kindergarten, etc., but it leads to these perverse effects that, and you have described this and shown this, how the parents, well-educated parents, do everything, use every means, both educational, financial, they use coaching, they use social pressure, they use everything. It's an enormous amount of resources and assets and cleverness they have to get their kids on the principle of meritocracy to positions. And I think this shows that a principle that we all believe in, because we would not want to, work in an environment, a university that denies or sells professorships or whatever. And you have to look at the perverse effects as well as the unintended consequences. Because what studies on dominance, and Bourdieu, has done this extremely well, it shows very clearly, of course, parents know they have more resources than, you know, the working class, etc. But at the same time, as a parent, you want to do the best for your kid. So, and this is what you do, but it maintains the system. So how to break this is a very complex issue, because if we just take meritocracy away, everything would fall apart and it's not going to happen. You know, you can go back in history, and in history, I mean, if you look at the educational system we had in Europe, the state and the church knew very well there are gifted children also, you know, in families that nobody would look at. And they were very clever in identifying these gifted children. They were identified already by the teacher or the priest at an early age, and then, you know, they would be shifted in there. I think even your university, Harvard, had for a certain time in a previous age, I would say, you know, a certain number of admissions that were reserved for people with, let's call it, non-conventional backgrounds. Yes? And I think something of this has to be fed into it again to open up for you know, people coming in. Also, the French, the grandes écoles, you know, they have this enormous problem because it sets a mindset and it infects the way how an extremely well-trained administrative, scientific elite governs the country. But it's a monoculture. And as we know, a monoculture in agriculture, but also in society, puts at risk the whole system if something unexpected happens. And believe me, working on uncertainty, something unexpected is going to happen. And then with a monoculture, you don't have the resources to answer. So you have to proceed in arguing at different levels, and you have to be able to use different kinds of leverage.
Yeah. What you just said, if I may just add something, since Harvard is now going through a you know, civil suit around the admission of Asian American, these topics are very much on everyone's mind. And the alternative, which is what the California system adopted, is class-based affirmative action instead of, you know, in our case, there was a Supreme Court case with the University of Michigan where the law today in the US is that you take all kinds of forms of diversity. That means people who are born in Nebraska, people who are fencers, African American, Asian, LGBTQ, etc. So race and genders are only one kind of diversity among many. But UCLA is the public school that has the largest number of first-generation students, with a majority minority school with more, where whites are in minority. It's an amazing machine for upward mobility, but it's also, my oldest daughter is at Berkeley. It's a huge mess. The university is like a bus station. They don't take care of the students. My daughter is dyslexic. In order for her to get access to more time, she never succeeded. So if a middle class parents like me, and we pay $65,000 a year for this, you know, and you know very well that if you send your kid to a public school, this is the gamble that you make. She's not in those small liberal arts colleges where kids are treated like, we call them snowflakes, you know. Children of that generation, they're snowflakes. They're all special in their own unique way. And they have to be maintained, you know, before they melt. They have to be taken care of. If you send your kid to Swarthmore or Dartmouth, you know, the world will be paid for them, and they will have climbing walls, and it will look like a you know, a golf course, you know, country clubs. It's easy. I'm going to be cynical.
But you know, when you mention class-based selection, there's a certain irony in it. If you think of the countries under communist rule, where you had also you had not
a form of privilege.
You had class-based selection, you know,
Inverse.
And it was the political commissar who decided who was allowed to study what and who was not admitted to universities.
Yeah.
But two questions here. May I just add a question that follows directly from what you were saying? This was one of my two questions. And the one that I wanted to ask is, both of you are talking in terms of systems of education and inequalities which are still nationally bounded. And I think the dangers, Helga, that you're pointing out of a monoculture are even more serious, because what you have got is a global formation of the elite through Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, such that you have a single monoculture which is no longer national, but which has got transmitted globally. And this is true both of academic agendas and political agendas, which I think makes for, this is not being hopeful, this is being really utterly pessimistic here, but I think one needs to think about the global dimension of the educational and resource inequality which gets compounded in this whole system of meritocracy. And the really crazy part, especially if you come from a country like India, is people will tell you, my son didn't get into an engineering college, the top one in India, so I just pay for him in Harvard. Because it's much more difficult to get into the IIT than to get into Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. So something has really shifted here in the frame in which we need to think about these questions of what these conversations could be about and with whom.
You know, in the IPSP, the International Panel on Social Progress Report, I co-chaired the last chapter on policy issues. And we had one interesting policy domain there, namely development economics. And it's a kind of very sober reading to see precisely a global elite in global international institutions setting the policy and agenda. And then you can see how this is dominated in a monocultural way by this global elite, and it's very, very sobering to see that in this domain where you have, people are partly being forced to follow the policies that come out of the World Bank, etc., etc. And you have this group of global economists trained in the same way, being networked all throughout, and this is what happens. And by the way, this is also true for the way how the financial system works. A colleague of ours in STS study, Mackenzie, he did a study on risk models in financial trading. And this was before the big crash in 2007 and 2008. And he asked the people who knew themselves the flaws of the risk models that were being used. And he said, well, why are you using these risk models? And the answer was, well, this allows us to talk to people in other financial institutions because they all know and use the same risk model. So you have one and the same risk model, you know the flaws, and you keep using it because you know everyone else is using the same. And then you're surprised that you have a Lehman crisis and the financial crisis in 2008.
The one bit of hope, well, I don't know if it is hope, but we know there's a sociologist at Essex, Yasemin Soysal, who's studying how the Chinese are in the process of positioning themselves as the machine where the Asian elite will be educated. And I don't know how, she argues, she's studying immigration in higher education. So they are marketing themselves to Cambodia and, whatever. Frankly, I don't know how successful it is. But we already know that there's a decline in number of Chinese students coming to the US, etc. So I don't know if it's a source of hope, but it would suggest at least a counter-hegemony in only the sciences, not the social sciences. They're doing terribly. So that might be the reason where the Indian MIT is doing so well, because it's the sciences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two, Miloš and then Ulrike. Mary has a mic.
Many thanks to both of you, and I have a question to Michelle. I really loved your talk, and I feel honored that you addressed legal history as a discipline with potential answers. We are working a lot with empirical evidence because we have all the sources, and it's about interpretation. And there are lots of factors you see when you look across, I mean, countries, empires, territories, and you see so many models. And I particularly like that you were drawing also on, not only on texts, but also on images, and potentially also about popular culture and their narratives and justification narratives, and where they come from, how they are promoted. I mean, we are always thinking about journalism, but we all know, for example, for the case of dystopias, movies are very powerful, graphic novels, and they give, I mean, the younger generation, which is not reading anymore the news, but they are giving them very powerful images what the future might be. We all know that, I mean, think about the roads and how society will be. But I would like to catch up some words Helga mentioned when she was addressing the role of state and church, because I found particularly interesting the comparison you made between different nations, and one might perceive France as a Catholic country, and I was thinking about the role or the particular potential role of religion, which we sometimes, I think empirically, we overlook it because we are living in universities at pretty secular places, but they're providing very powerful narratives very often. And also there is a completely different handling of images in the different Christian religions and beyond. So do you have any figures about that, how religion provides potential narratives or does not?
Well, I know that, you know, France is now extremely secular, but one great comparison is Canada and the US, because, as you probably know, the evangelical Christians have totally restructured what the Republican Party looks like today in the US. In Canada, you don't have that. You have multi-party system, and one of our former graduate students, Lydia Bean, wrote a book on comparing, I think, Detroit and Windsor, which are two, you know, across the border from each other. And it's really a micro look into the political culture of the two countries. So, and issues such as abortion, which are absolutely crucial in the US as a divider, are not in anti-gay attitudes as well. They're, you know, so, yes, and of course the case of Poland is...
Well, if I may also jump in here, I mean, now we have in Brazil a new dictator, and he has been, the possibility of his victory has been due to the force of the evangelical churches. And he knew from very early on to draw on their support. And I know colleagues from Portugal who have been working in Brazil for years, who were very much aware how the evangelicals not only had narratives, but they took power of the banks and of the financial system. And so, you know, it's, if we think of religion, we think of the, you know, the content without looking at the infrastructure. And the economic infrastructure of churches anywhere, I would say, are very, very important in order to explain, because it's not just ideas, it's practical help that people get if the state is not willing, not able, failed states, they cannot provide any service. You see this in the Islamic world, you see this in countries in South Africa, you see this in countries also in Africa, where the state does not provide for, you know, the basic necessity, be it medicine, be it education, whatever, you know. Religion steps in various forms, and for this, of course, religion needs financial resources, and people are very clever in setting up a kind of religious business model. And therefore, when you say religion, you know, let's look at it as a more complex assemblage, and not just article of faith or a theological, you know, superstructure.
Also, thank you, Helga and Michelle, for both contributions. I was left a bit puzzled by this centrality that is put to narratives. I was puzzled in two ways. On the one hand, the question was already asked, I mean, who produces, who circulates, whose narratives are they? Because your analysis shows that the upper middle class falls into this kind of, let me shortcut it and call it depression. But on the other hand, I was wondering if certain narratives which we as social scientists find right now appalling give a lot of hope to certain other groups in the society. So the question of hope and despair is kind of interesting, who speaks to whom here. And in that sense, whose narrative of hopes would they be? And then if you take the narrative concept a bit broader and you think about what kinds of narratives do you have to trade in for a particular narrative of hope? And I'm giving you an example from the US. Former PhD student of mine studied working class women who managed to become professors in elite universities in the US. And what was interesting and what I really liked was a part when she told how these people go to social events. And what they tell coherently is that they cannot tell any stories anymore about their lives because, and one quote has I have kept in my mind over the last 15 years when she said, would I speak to anybody at Harvard about my father flipping pizzas? And I really like this kind of, so what narratives do you have to hand in and hand over of your identity in order to be able to become a part of this hope narrative, namely to social upgrading through getting out of these education. So narrativity is a complex thing, and you mentioned the coffee house in Habermas. So what is the coffee, who negotiates there? Who was it, the Habermasian coffee house? And exactly how do we reproduce some of these things?
I have a question to Michelle that goes that follows from that. I was wondering what we collectively as social scientists know about the conditions under which narratives are believed, when they cease to be believed, and which kind of narratives are believed and unbelieved. And you know, it's a complex issue, but you know, there's a realistic component to it when you hear that almost 50% of 30-year-old workers in you know, the former steel companies in Philadelphia, etc., earn less than their fathers did when the fathers were 30 years old. You know, I would say, okay, that's a realistic component, and your belief in the narrative may drop to the floor. But we know, on the other hand, there are people that know it's against their interests. The Trump supporters, they should know, and probably they know, but then it's compensated by other components. So, you know, there's not one narrative of hope, I would say. There are different and also contradicting sub-narratives that need to be teased out. And my question is simply, what do we know, under which conditions do people stop to believe in narratives? When do they say, you know, it's bullshit, you know, you have been misleading me? And when do they continue, even if they know it may be bullshit and you are betraying me?
Yeah. Well, these are rich questions. The one paper I know that answers the question that you ask is Michael Schutzen, How Culture Works. And he has, it's a paper that came out in Theory and Society, 1988. And he has criteria such as resonance. So many people are writing on resonance now. There's some follow-up. There's a paper that came out in Sociological Theory last year by Chris Bell and others. But I feel it doesn't do the whole job. You know, he has 5 criteria. Retrievability is one of them. So, and he's a, for those of you who don't know him, he's a leading sociologist of journalism. He's very, very good. He's at the Columbia School of Journalism. And he also wrote a book titled Citizenship, which is basically about the historical creation of the public sphere in the US. But it's not, you know, he stops, I think, in the 19th century. So this is why I said I'd like this book to be written, and it's not written. And my colleague has this wonderful book on China, but it's not the US. The question of Trump, of course, the Trump supporters, a lot of ink has been poured over that question. I mean, I think that we know that Trump has made nationalism, patriotism, which is a very high status dimension of the identity of the working class. They're extremely proud of being American. He talks about this all the time. And their admiration for the rich is also something that he has pushed. There are books such as Jennifer Silva, and another guy named Ofer Sharon, who have studied the working class that are stuck, that are experiencing every day the fact that the American dream is a bankrupt dream. And Sharon's book is partly good because it's called, what is it called? He compares the working class in Israel and the US, and he shows that in the US, when people are unemployed, they use a language of Alcoholic Anonymous to self-help. I need to find within myself my passion that I can sell. So it's an extremely individualistic language about solution, whereas in Israel, it's like the market is rotten, someone's going to be unemployed, this year it's me. So they really distance themselves from their plight. So I think what we see in the US is the absence of alternative for many of these people, which explains, I think, the disaster, the health disaster that we're facing, precisely because there's no alternative. But I totally agree with you, Ulrike, that I present my talk emphasized narratives, but I'm also would like to put equal emphasis somehow in the paper. I say I'm not downplaying the importance of inequality. Inequality is extremely important. And of course, you have a whole structure of diffusion of cultural repertoires. They don't exist in and of themselves. They remain salient and accessible because you have institutional forces and, you know, professionals, knowledge workers. That's why I did my brief scaffolding of who are the people carrying these messages. But I need to spend more time reading in what research is being conducted today in the sociology of the media. Frankly, I don't know if there are people in this room who do this, but it's a field that is very cultural study-ish, you know. There's not that many really good empirical studies of, how our representations of the world take place. In my previous book, I always had a model of supply side, you know, in the sense that I focus on what are the cultural repertoires that are made more readily available to French workers as opposed to American workers. So you can do this in the context of comparative research, but it does not, I never looked very specifically at who are the carriers, like the McKinsey work that you do. I think when it comes to economics, we have really good studies now of how the culture of economics is a global culture and has taken roots. But we don't have, and it's a dominant language, so yes, but there's a lot of other themes that are not studied as well, so.
Merit.
Both of you, one of you mentioned the snowflakes, and both of you talked about science, and I'd like to ask you a question I studied about 20 years ago at your university. And now I came back on a sabbatical at a different, now I was at the law school. And what struck me was the unwillingness of these pampered students to engage in difficult questions. And I think that's basically what science is about, including the social sciences, is ultimately to look for truth. And to some extent, I think there is a discrepancy between the insistence on respect and divergence and difference and to go where the truth will lead you. I'm a professor of Islamic law. And I talked there with the students who came from Muslim-majority countries and who are now there. And all they were talking about was microaggressions in the Western society. And I mentioned them, you come from countries where the people are literally crucified. And you talk about microaggressions against women wearing a hijab. I mean, what's wrong with you? And these questions were not mentioned, and they were not unmentionable, also in the classroom. And I'm asking you, both of you, what is the role also of the teacher, particularly in the social sciences, to navigate that difficult boundary? You mentioned yourself the fat rights movement. What's wrong with fat? It's one thing to insist on a human being being treated with dignity, but it's an altogether different thing on insisting that eating too much unhealthy food is not a good thing. It's not a healthy choice. Therefore, as a scientist, I should say that this is wrong. Mm-hmm. And you cannot insist that this is your lifestyle. And how do you navigate this?
Mm-hmm. You start from the US side, and I say something about Europe. It's a good division.
Oh, yeah. It's very complicated because I think in the current moment, and I see it on Twitter because I follow Twitter, so many people who are studying race in the US right now are not making the difference between scholarship and the drawing of moral boundaries. And this is something that I would not say publicly in the US because there's so many situations that are explosive, truly explosive, because there's such a language of, recrimination about people who come from stigmatized groups who feel that they have been silenced. And this is a moment where the ability of the silenced people to speak publicly has become really sacred. And it's very hard to respond to this by saying, yes, but within limits, because we need to be able to make the difference between, microaggression and I've seen it as president of the American Sociological Association. The person who followed me is the first Latino president, and his presidential talk was basically telling a progressive sociologist that you think you're not racist, but you are racist, really. And this happens in a context where Trump is president. So my own preferred strategy at the current moment is to attack Trump instead of attacking progressive social scientists. But this is not something that I could say publicly. I said to him privately, but this is truly not a debate that you can have publicly because you're going to be crucified. And it's also in the context where you have the free speech movement, which I support, but the equally important value in academia is inclusion. So I believe strongly that we need to balance these two things, because if, as happened in my university, you bring Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve, on campus to speak, all African-American students feel very much that he's being brought there to tell them you don't belong, you're here because of affirmative action. So, and that really works against their ability to learn. The institution has a duty to make everyone feel that they belong. So frankly, I don't have a recipe. I think we need to make decisions on a case-by-case basis, but it's hard.
I'm very glad I'm not a professor in the US right now. And I say this, I was in Berkeley last year for a short visit, and talking to American colleagues, it's really unbelievable. I spent my years at Columbia University during the Vietnam War, and the contrast could not be greater. But having said this, my take on this is that in the American context, somehow the wars, the cultural wars that are being fought out in academia are a proxy for a political vacuum. You cannot, have the kind of political discussions that you would have in a public sphere, however it is structured, It's just not possible because there's a vacuum there. So people who have concerns, who have grievances, who want to discuss, who have the intellectual means, carry this into the university, and it's toxic. It's really toxic. And luckily in Europe we are not there, and I hope we will not get there. And therefore I think it's very important to keep cultivating a sphere, a public sphere, where you can have political arguments, where you can discuss, and also to wean ourselves a bit from the addiction to social media. Because we know the social media, everything goes at an extreme speed and you cannot retrieve. So we have to step back and to create a space where you can discuss. And then in addition, let me just make one remark on a very striking generational difference that I see. In my time, when you had a social movement, people would get organized and they would be able to appoint someone that would speak for them. So I would say, Shalini, she is great, I appoint her, we appoint her as our speaker, she's our representative. But the moment we don't like anymore what she does, we would say, no, now we turn towards Michel and we vote for Michel. And this organizational capacity has become lost in the present young generation. They are extremely clever in organizing through flash mobs, through social media. You can get people to move, to be present, etc. But they are hesitant and they don't believe anymore that they have even the right to appoint someone to speak for them. So there's a distrust of representation, a distrust in their own organizational ability. And I think this again needs to be nurtured again. It's something you can learn, something where you can learn how to make mistakes also. Trust is something that is not worth trust if it cannot be revoked.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
If you'll allow me to end on that note of generational advice. No, I was going to say, listening to both of you, I was in very, very different ways. I was reminded of Albert Hirschman's very seminal insight. Societies go through cycles, and they go through cycles where there is cultivation of private virtue, and then there are times when there are times of collective political action. And I think that would be a hopeful note I would like to end on.
The narrative of cycles.
The narrative of cycles is my only hopeful note for this evening, but there is a hopeful note for tomorrow, which is to say, thank you so much, both Michel and Helga, for having addressed all the questions in a way that we're going to address tomorrow. Questions of power, of citizenship, of inequality, of law. And that's what we're going to spend the day discussing with one another. So thank you very much for being with us here this evening. And I hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow. Thank you very, very much once again.